My name is Noah Romero. Thanks so much for joining us here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. All right, so greetings, everybody. My name is Noah Romero, as mentioned, and I'm an assistant professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Hampshire College here in Amherst, Massachusetts. Thank you for being here, and thank you to Jan and Youngbach for setting this up. As a representative of Hampshire College and the Five College Consortium, I want to begin by naming that I am on unceded Nipmuc land and name the neighboring Indigenous nations, the Hassnamisko Nipmuc Nation and the Mashpee Wampanoag and the Wampanoag Tribe of Gayhead to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican and Nonotuck to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. I also give thanks to the Nuuvi and the Las Vegas Paiute tribe, the traditional stewards and rightful owners of the land that is now called the Las Vegas Valley. We also acknowledge that Indigenous nations have entertained the empty words and gestures of invaders and opportunists for centuries, so it's important to continually interrupt processes that colonize and dispossess, including in education. With this acknowledgement comes a shared responsibility to work intentionally toward authentic engagement and good relationship with Indigenous communities. So over the last decade, I've worked deeply with Indigenous communities in the Philippines, in Aotearoa or New Zealand, and here in the US. The global nature of that work reflects my own positionality as a deterritorialized Philippine subject, standing with the Indigenous peoples of the places where I live and work. I've devoted my life to the study of decolonizing education, which we'll get into today, particularly the informal versions of it. But decolonizing education refers to forms of teaching and learning that foster healing, balance, connectedness, self-determination, the rematriation of stolen land, and the resurgence of Indigenous lifeways upon those lands. Decolonizing education is a response to colonization, or the violent imposition of Eurocentric ways of thinking that have metastasized into the existential crises that face us all today, like climate change, global inequity, and geopolitical instability. Decolonization calls for an end to settler colonialism and agitates for Indigenous futurity, or the dislodgement of the racialized, heteropatriarchal, and ableist hierarchies that give order to social life in settlers. That give order to social life in settler states, and we want to replace those with Indigenous values like sustainability and kinship ties that honor all relatives, regardless of age, ability, or status. These reciprocal collectivities hold multiple worlds in balance and contain within them the raw material needed for the abolition of settler reality. So deep breath, that's a lot, right? What my research does is remind us that we don't need to start from scratch because this is already happening. We just need to know where to look. So today I'll be talking about decolonial underground pedagogy, or the liberatory learning that occurs primarily informally in subcultural communities led by Indigenous and minoritized people. By way of definition, subcultures are groups that organize around interests that mainstream society deems frivolous at best and menacing at worst, but they also help minoritized people create educational opportunities for themselves. Subcultural learning environments let us participate in decolonial futures as they materialize in real time. And for that reason, they have a lot to teach us about what it means to educate for ideas like social justice, anti-racism, and human rights. So to structure this session, I'll introduce informal learning and talk about how it shows up in some of the studies that feature in my first book. It's called Decolonial Underground Pedagogy, Subcultural Learning for Peace and Human Rights. And that'll come out next year in June through Bloomsbury's Peace and Human Rights Education series. So in that book, I focus on BIPOC participation in 3 subcultures that I belong to myself. And those are the unschooling movement, punk rock, and skateboarding. And from there, I hope to engage with all of you in korero, kwentuhan, or open discussion. So do ask to hold your questions till the end. There will be about, I want to spend most of this time talking to you all. So there will be time built into this session for question and answer. The main question that organizes my research is simple. How do we decolonize education? And that question is complicated by my own experience. I didn't come to understand what it means to decolonize education by studying it in school. I learned it at punk shows, by playing music, by skating, and by being in conversation. And that led me to ask these questions. What do subcultures offer Indigenous and minoritized people? And how do those offerings differ by context and place as we navigate colonial terrains? How does the primarily informal learning that happens in subculture help us advance the political imperatives of decolonization? And how can those insights help us make education more equitable in other contexts and create new regimes of truth that center Indigenous values like sustainability and kinship with human and non-human relatives? I draw from the work of Linda Tuhiwai Smith and use decolonizing methodologies like community research, storytelling, and the close reading of texts, cultural productions, and my own memories. I also practice the Indigenous Philippine methodology of Pakapakapa. I'm from the Philippines. I don't think I mentioned that, by the way. I'm sorry. I'm from a place called Narvacan, Ilocos Sur in the Philippines. And I do a Philippine methodology called Pakapakapa, which translates to feeling around in the dark. It's suppositionless research. It calls us to immerse ourselves deeply in community, but before claiming knowledge about that community and before even asking questions. Pakapakapa asks us to think deeply about our own communities and use whatever tools are on hand to really come to know and embody the profound truths held within them. Decolonizing and Indigenous methodologies unsettle the disciplinarity of the Western Academy and remind us that all tools are important and valid when it comes to advancing self-determination. Even quantitative methods, believe it or not, those can be decolonizing too. It just depends on the intentionality that you bring to it. And I ascribe this, what I call disciplinary disobedience, what others have called as well, in the name of liberation, and I mentor and support my students in their efforts to do the same. So informal learning, the topic of the day, refers to unplanned educational experiences that occur in everyday life. There are three features of informal learning that are applicable in most contemporary settings, including in subcultures. The first is that informal learning stems from the everyday concerns of learners. It's different from the education that occurs in contexts specifically constructed to teach, like organized lectures and sermons, like schools and church. While accidental or incidental knowledge construction certainly does take place in places like that, informal learning refers specifically to knowledge and experience attained through leisure, play, spontaneous discussions, and moving from one place to another. An example of how this works is baking, working specifically with a child to bake. You know, by baking bread, either independently or as part of a team, a kid might learn a lot of things. They might learn things related to reading, following directions, measuring ingredients, the basic chemical reactions involved in baking. They might learn about mise en place, or how to organize a kitchen so that it is safe and clean and conducive to baking. They might learn that making an edible loaf of bread requires both a high degree of sensitivity toward gradual changes in how the dough looks, smells, feels, and even sounds. I think anyone who's made a pound cake knows how that goes. And that kind of learning is informal because the goal of it is to bake bread, or maybe even eat it. It's not to learn how to bake and then be evaluated on the result. It's to actually eat the thing. So though the learning folks do when they're living their lives or attempting to feed themselves is still important, even if it's not being done in order to be measured. What Nancy Griffith, who wrote a book called The Unschooling Handbook, argues that doesn't make the knowledge skills gained any less real. So informal learning emphasizes dialogue, conversation, and direct interaction, and tends to occur in contexts that build up trust, affinity, respect, and even affection between educators and learners. Informal learning can't occur when information is conveyed through explicit hierarchical teaching, when one person is recognized as an authority figure, and where learning the appropriate knowledge to be attained from the interaction is determined in advance. Informal learning instead occurs in environments where participants engage directly with one another, where their differences can be settled through the buildup of mutual understanding. So that dialogic nature of informal learning allows for the type of reflection needed to engage with challenges to one's pre-existing knowledge. And lastly, I'll note that the emphasis informal learning places on reflection suggests that conversation and dialogue doesn't need to be restricted to human beings. Informal learning is a product of dialogue followed by reflection. So an informal education can emerge out of reflection and observations of one's surroundings. So it can occur in engagements with others, our environments, and even ourselves. So a last note, informal education involves some measure as well of consciousness raising or political awakening, is what theorists of informal learning have deemed as one of the most important aspects of it. What's learned informally builds upon a learner's understanding of how the world works and their role in it. It's important as well to note that the so-called political edge of informal learning doesn't mean informal learners learn a specific political ideology. Rather, those conversational and reflective dimensions of informal learning allow participants to ponder the broader implications of their everyday interactions, and it allows them to ponder them more deeply than decontextualized education ever could. And that's because those political lessons learned informally tend to have real effects on learners' lives. Mills and Kraftel, who wrote an influential book on informal learning, use the term upscaling to refer to that cognitive and embodied learning process by which informal learners find links between their individual interests and wider local and global concerns. So with all that in mind, I want to get into a few examples of how this plays out in different minority-led subcultures. The first is the unschooling movement, which you may or may not know is a form of homeschooling that basically advocates for a lack of curriculum over an emphasis on self-direction. My work with Indigenous unschoolers reveals important insights into the decolonizing potential of radical philosophies of education like that. Student-centered, self-directed, autonomous, community-embedded education is not important just because it's effective or enriching. It's important because it shows that decolonization can extend to every aspect of one's life. So I recently co-authored an article called Unschooling in Indigenous Education with Sandra Yellowhorse, a Diné or Navajo writer and scholar who I'm proud to call a colleague and friend. So in that study, we examined the resonances between unschooling and Indigenous education, both of which traditionally centers LOPI. That's education that prioritizes listening, observation, and pitching in, rather than memorization and the regurgitation of decontextualized information. Unschooled herself, Sandra notes that informal learning was integral to her learning to understand the ancestral knowledge of her people, particularly the concept of that's K''E, or the interconnected networks of kinship and responsibility that bring people and land together in relationship. In 2018, I introduced the concept of critical unschooling and argued that homeschooling should be a journey of unlearning, deprogramming, and undoing the generational trauma visited upon our communities by the discourses of colonialism and the coloniality of power. And this year, Odawa and Ojibwe scholar Roxanne Gould expanded that definition to say that for Indigenous people, unschooling is, and I quote, our education, our way of life. Western colonial education cannot teach us how to be Indigenous. We can only learn that by being with our people, on our homelands, practicing our culture as it was given to us in those original instructions. These teachings are based on the 7 principles of love, honesty, respect, truth, bravery, wisdom, and humility. Roxanne's engagement with critical unschooling reminded me that it's not just a refutation of systemic inequity or banking models of education. It's not just an oppositional practice. Self-directed learning is a foundational part of what Roxanne calls, or what Ojibwe called Bimadizuin, or the good life. Unschooling has a major influence in how I teach now at Hampshire, and how I carry out the roles of mentor, guide, and accomplice. My teaching aims to develop relational autonomy, the degree to which students are empowered to take decisive actions that benefit their communities. Relational autonomy encourages us to think critically about how systemic issues are relevant to our lived experiences and collective aspirations. And cultivating relational autonomy also involves recognizing my own responsibilities to my community. So I continuously seek out and integrate feedback to ensure that students are supported in their learning. So that means not waiting until course evaluations come out at the end of the semester to do anything about my teaching practice. That's an everyday thing. And one of the key material affects of that commitment and approach is I made homework optional. I'm happy to talk more about how that works and to preach the benefits of it to any teachers in attendance in the Q&A. So a decolonizing education demands that we learn to identify and carry out our responsibilities to our communities. And that idea informs my work on punk rock pedagogy, or the educative dimension of punk subculture. And people often tell me that punk, heavy metal, and punk and heavy metal in particular are white subcultures, and ask me if it's maybe counterproductive to study BIPOC participation in these scenes. And I offer that it was a Choctaw and Black guitarist named Charlie Patton who pioneered the Mississippi blues by banging out medicine drum rhythms on his guitar as he played it. And that created the foundational clay for every form of rock and roll, along with hip hop and even electronic dance music. So punk rock and heavy metal have always been Black and Indigenous music. They still are and always will be. So that belief in the ancestral vitality at the core of heavy music subculture helped me develop the 3 pillars of punk rock pedagogy. The first is reflection, or critical thinking about the material conditions of oppression. The second is the use of punk music as a means for processing these reflections. And the third is concrete action undertaken in solidarity with marginalized people. I use punk rock pedagogy to study resurgent aesthetic sovereignty in Aotearoa, or the work of Maori punks whose music confronts the ongoing legacies of genocide, dispossession, and colonial miseducation in so-called New Zealand. Case in point, my friend Waidahu Grant, pictured here, third from the left, from your left, my left as well. Despite, Waidahu is the lead singer of Halftime, the only all-Maori punk band in Aotearoa. And despite New Zealand being heralded as a world leader in democracy and Indigenous rights, Maori still face entrenched discrimination in all aspects of settler society. Maori comprise 53% of the prisoner population, despite being only 16% of the general population. And that's linked to a long history of institutional racism, land theft, and the suppression of Maori language and its customs. Waidahu uses punk music to critique and dismiss the standard stories that equate Indigenous bodies in Aotearoa with criminality and Indigenous knowledge with lack. So they have a song called Whakamārama, and that is inspired by the haka. I think some folks may be familiar with that. The haka is a ceremonial dance accompanied by chanting that is popularly associated with combat. I think popularly associated with rugby as well. But it's more accurately described as an invitation to engage. In that song, Waidahu says, Whakamara kia mai o kia ho. Explain me to myself. It's an invitation to the colonial schoolmaster to tell him who he is, winking that he knows that colonial systems will never understand the deep kinship ties that bind him to his land and his ancestors. Punk rock pedagogy doesn't end with music. That experiential knowledge scales upward and radiates outward, and Maori punks engage in direct action on behalf of their communities. For Waidahu, this means organizing benefit concerts for other punks experiencing health issues or financial hardship. They just finished a tour of Wales in which they explored with Welsh bands the role of punk rock and music in general in preserving and advancing threatened indigenous knowledges across colonial contexts. So Waidahu's walk to elderhood through punk pedagogy has imbued him with mana, or the authority to know that he is now the knowledge bearer, the elder, the guide, and the author of his destiny. So like punk rock, skateboarding holds vast knowledge about how decolonization is a learning experience. My research on skateboarding and skate pedagogy shows that it has the added dimension of a physical education that cultivates an understanding of how our bodies and our environments are interconnected. And that understanding is unlocked by the skateboard itself, making the skateboard a relative that transforms our relationships with our environments. On 2 feet, I always say this, on 2 feet, a handrail is just a handrail, but on a skateboard, a handrail is Mount Everest. On 2 feet, a pebble is just a pebble. On a skateboard, it's the most powerful thing in the world. It can stop your wheels instantly. It'll send you face and teeth first into the concrete. So those spatial and epistemic reconfigurations that the skateboard unlocks in our minds makes it so that any skater always has to respect the land that they're skating on. So that inspired an article I wrote called You're Skating on Native Land, Queering and Decolonizing Skate Pedagogy, which explores how Native skaters skating on Native land can show us what it truly means to be sovereign and free. And that study centers Apache Skateboards. It's an organization, and its co-founders, Douglas Miles and Douglas Miles Jr. Apache Skateboards started in 2001 when Doug Sr., already a renowned artist by that time, painted a skateboard with an Apache warrior on it for his then teenage son. Since then, they've been working nonstop to increase indigenous representation in skateboarding, and Doug Jr. has grown into a professional skateboarder, but he has a deeply ethical understanding of his role. He's hard at work on the Apache Passion Project, which is a grassroots initiative to build skate parks in Indian country and on Native American reservations. He recognizes that the skate park's importance also extends beyond skateboarding. Skate parks offer Native youth opportunities to grow into photographers, videographers, musicians, and artists, and even cooks. Advancing the goals of tribal sovereignty and well-being by cultivating young people's creative, social, and professional skills and allowing them to build their futures the way they see them. Apache Skateboards is accountable to the real needs of Indigenous youth. The article shows how this engagement is quite different from what is quickly becoming the dominant form of skate culture, and that's Olympic skateboarding. So now that skateboarding is an Olympic sport, anyone who hopes to be officially recognized as one of the best skaters in the world has to compete under the flag of a nation state. The category that they compete in, or the men's or women's contest, is determined by lab tests, reducing the infinite world of possibility that skateboarding can unlock to a list of chromosomes, hormones, body parts, and permission slips. As an Olympic sport, skateboarding is not about having fun with your friends or pursuing your own goals. The strictures of Olympic competition turn it into an exercise in cis-heteronormative nation building, of colonization. So contrasting Apache skateboards with Olympic skateboarding helps us theorize decolonial underground pedagogy and informal learning, the informal learning that occurs at the foundation of it, as a counterpoint to the inevitability of the settler state. The power of Apache skateboards doesn't come from the imposition of normative power. It comes from the people and our healing relationships with matter, land, one another, and ourselves. But recognizing the skateboard as an ancestor and a relative makes it so Apache skateboards helps people become aware that Native American art is a living tradition and that the Apache Nation is not only still here, it'll live forever in dynamic relation with its land, history, people, and practice. So in thinking about where this research is headed, I note that decolonial underground pedagogy and the various explorations of how decolonization happens informally is only the beginning. The transnational and suppositionless nature of my work creates a lot of opportunities to research decolonizing initiatives all over the world. And these struggles are important to understand in and of themselves. They also help us understand how the decolonial work we do in our own communities has global significance. But despite all that momentum, we still live in an environment where organized attacks on Indigenous education, ethnic studies, multicultural education, comprehensive sexuality education, queer theory, critical race theory, and the few avenues that allow historically, persistently, historically and persistently minoritized students engage in the tenuous exercise of freedom. These things are always under threat. And it makes it so that these students, BIPOC students, might only ever encounter a decolonizing, holistic, or healing form of education in subculture. They might only ever encounter that informally. So that reminds me that my central research question, how do we decolonize education, remains unanswered. How do we decolonize education or practice insurgent, emergent, and resurgent pedagogies of our sovereignty in our classrooms, our relationships, and in our communities and toward ourselves? There's a lot of work to be done, and I hope we can do it together. Thank you. And don't miss the next presentation in this series with Drs. Butler and Shi. Thank you again. I'm happy to take any questions. There's my contact information. So we got a question here from Jen, who asks if unschooling is similar to the Montessori method. I think so. I don't know too much about the Montessori method. Those of you putting thank you in the chat, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. Thank you for getting on a Zoom call in 2023. That is that's not something I would necessarily do all the time. I appreciate you all being here. My understanding of the Montessori method is it is quite radical, but it does have its own sort of ideology that it imposes on children, which is quite different from creating spaces where young people are able to define their own educational goals, and there are people whose responsibility it is to create safe and productive context for them to do that, and support them along the way. So in a lot of ways, Montessori is still quite schoolish, which is not to say that there's not a place for that, but it's different from unschooling in that respect. Yeah, Jen, thank you again, Jen, for the question. Jen writes, what tips might you have for educators who want to weave in informal learning when they teach in a structured environment? That is, I guess that depends on how structured your environment is. I always tell my teacher candidates that for the most part, the things that we talk about in class in terms of decolonizing education, critical pedagogy, learner-centered pedagogy, in terms of your teaching practice, you're going to probably have to sneak that in. It's not something that a principal or superintendent is going to expect or ask or even want you to do. So if you believe that it is important to decolonize education, that it is important for students, especially young people, to self-direct their learning, then you'll have to work within the parameters of the job you've been given to create that space for them. I had a student who came up with a really lovely example of this. They're concerned about indigenous language loss and indigenous language preservation. So she built that into a curriculum around teaching about ancient Mesopotamia. And it's simple enough. She gives the context, the history, the use of cuneiform, but then foregrounds this lesson by asking the students, well, what would you do if you could not use, well, this is what a language does. Language holds your culture's knowledge and values. Language makes it so you can express yourself the way you've been raised to express yourself. What would you do if you couldn't, if that was taken away from you? If someone said that you couldn't use that language anymore? And it's a simple enough question, I think, but I put myself in the shoes of like my 7-year-old being asked that question, and it made it so that the following lesson around culture and cuneiform and ancient Mesopotamia was that much more invested in it. So you can really do little things like that. You just kind of have to think about the ethics and intentionality that you're bringing to your work. Yodit, I'm sorry if, and feel free to just unmute and start talking if you're more comfortable that way. It's more fun for me. Yeah, to answer your question, Yodit, and I'm sorry if I pronounced this wrong. I will definitely provide my contact information. There is a lot of amazing reading on African, sub-Saharan African indigenous education and philosophy. I certainly recommend the work of George Sefadeh and Leslie Lagrange, who work with Khoisan communities. Leslie Lagrange works with Khoisan knowledge and is Khoisan himself from South Africa. George Sefadeh, I believe, is Ghanaian and represents a lot of that knowledge as well. Yes, no homework. It helps that I work at Hampshire College, which is by its mission an experimenting institution. So we have a lot of leeway to do sort of what am I trying to say? Experimental pedagogies. I realized that early on in the semester that a lot of students were having a hard time with the weekly homework assignment, which is basically to summarize one of the readings and identify how it relates to their lives. What I did was I used the PT format. If there are any Philippine studies folks in the building, you might be familiar with that. It's pioneered by Alison Tintianco Kubalis over at SF State. But it basically just asks the student to break down the reading in terms of its problem, theory, evidence, and action. And I tell them that if you're able to do that with a reading, then you understand the reading. And if you're able to do that with 10 readings, you've got the good basis for a research paper. If you're able to do that with 50 readings, you've got a lit review for a master's or a PhD even. If you're able to do that with 100 readings, then you're an expert in your field. You really know what's going on in this field. So that's a way of sort of demystifying and taking away the anxiety around reading, around doing academic work. But a lot of students were struggling with that. A lot of students had a lot of pressure and work to do in other classes. So I thought, if you want to make a research career out of this, this is a tool that I encourage you to use. And if you want to do this exercise, do it and send it to me so I could give you feedback and we can start a conversation around ideas that are interesting to you or confusing to you. But I'm not personally that invested in you being able to do all this and do this song and dance of getting it to me on time, and I have to chase it down. I'm not really interested in that sort of punitive and surveillance aspect of the learning. This is a tool that you can use and is available to you. If you're interested in taking your work to the next level, then use it and start a conversation. But the most important thing is you do the readings and you show up to class ready to discuss these concepts. That is where the learning that I value and that I think is more beneficial to you is going to happen. So let's prioritize that. Um, and there's the other aspect of I have to write too. So I don't really want to read 30 crappy assignments every week. So there is that aspect too. The feedback on it was fantastic. Students said explicitly, like, not having to worry about a weekly homework assignment made it so that I didn't have to go through the motions of doing it, and I could just be present and engaged with the actual content of the course. And I teach Indigenous and decolonizing education. It's very important for me for them to have that feeling of presence and engagement with the ideas. And I think doing away with homework went a long way in cultivating that. Yeah, Serena, the elements are a problem. What is the main issue that this reading is concerned with? What is the theory? The T is for theory. Theory is what sort of frames of reference, what sort of knowledge traditions is the author using to like think through that problem? What's the evidence? So what data is the author using to support the claims they're making? And the last bit is action. What is the next step that the author is suggesting? Or what is the next step that you as the reader are suggesting? Those are both valid answers to that action question. So once you understand those things, any reading, it could be a 5,000-page thesis on philosophy or the philosophy of being. If you can break it down to the PT, then you understand it. That's something that it's important for me to communicate that to students who kind of like, especially like undergraduate students who want to like pore over every word. And that's important to an extent, but if you could PT it, that's really that first step in consciousness. Oh, Roni, I appreciate this question. How does diversity position itself into the informal learning methodology? I will say that in the extant research, the diversity questions of intersectionality and identity are pretty under theorized. So, that basic sort of that basic example that they use in a lot of informal learning research is like, well, you learn a lot walking from home to the community center. And I think Mills and Kraft will use the example of walking from home to somewhere in New York City. Well, how does that equation change if you're a young Black man whose body and movement is being policed? I think you could still, as a researcher, you can still study that as informal learning, but the things that are being learned are going to be quite different than if you're not a Black person navigating an urban, carceral, and surveillant space. There's definitely needs to be more research on that. I think decolonial underground pedagogy contributes to that, but absolutely there needs to be someone who is willing to make those differences explicit. Sure thing. So there's my email address if folks have if folks want to tap in um, after this. But yeah, we got about 20 minutes. I'd love to hear some voices if y'all aren't too shy. Oh, thank you for that, Roni. Great to hear you, Adi. So are folks in the session mostly are you all teachers? Are you researchers? I'd love to learn what kind of um, where you're coming from to this space and yeah, if there's any tensions in your professional practice that are, oh, the microphones are not enabled. Okay, sorry. Young Buck, if you want to make it a free for all and just let people unmute and talk, I'm happy to do it that way. Thank you for this question. For folks who, for other folks, the question is, do you have some ideas on how to use informal learning to improve professional efficacy in areas such as teacher mentoring? And Carolina is with the NIAE, National Institute for the Advancement of Education. Yes, in terms of advancing professional practice and professional development, I think the reflection piece of informal learning is important, especially with teachers who are just sort of full on from the moment they wake up, and whose days don't end until well after the final, school bell has rung, right? I think encouraging teachers to reflect on, well, what did I do today? What kind of interactions did I have with the students? What kind of interactions did I have with their parents? What kind of interactions did I have with my peers and administrators? What kind of feelings did those interactions bring up for me? How did they differ according to the type of stakeholder that I was interacting with? What kind of things are being communicated in these interactions? I think once you do that, I think if a teacher does that for even 1 week, they're going to have a very compelling data set as to what kind of organization they function in, what kind of organization they work for, what kind of environment they are dedicating their lives to, and how that environment affects their professional and personal subjectivity. So I think building in reflective time into a teacher's day is an important consideration of any educational leader, encouraging teachers to engage in that reflection honestly and candidly, and maybe if there were even really specific tools around identifying how a teacher's sort of recollections and reactions, like where are those coming from? Where are they coming from a place of wanting to impose their authority or to demonstrate their expertise? Or are they coming from a place where I'm really invested in a student's development in this way? And are there barriers in me being able to do that? If every teacher did that, I think the field and educational leadership and educational scholars would have an amazingly rich data set to advocate for future trajectories and policy decisions that are probably quite different from where those trajectories are heading now, I would say. So encourage teachers to reflect and encourage students to have space to explore and play and make mistakes.
Hi, Dr. Romero. I didn't want to interrupt. This is Yodit. Can you hear me?
Hi, Yodit. Yeah, you're good.
Yeah. I just want to say thank you so much for the talk. And I learned quite a bit. I'm actually in graduate school now, pursuing my PhD, and my interest is definitely African Indigenous pedagogy. And so I'm trying to find as much as I can on that particular topic. And so I just wanted to say this was really informative. I like to hear what other scholars have to say about it. And even just the two people that you mentioned, I've already looked them up, and it seems like it's very promising. So thank you so much. I just wanted to let you know.
Yeah, so that means so much, Yodi. Thank you. I appreciate you. I appreciate your questions and your research and where it's going. I remember that there's a book by Onyeronke Oyewumi. She is a Yoruba feminist scholar. She wrote a book called The Invention of Women. You might, I apologize if you're familiar with it already, but that's certainly a foundational one for me. I think if there are no further questions, I'm happy to let you all go. That's something that is part of my professional practice too. If the work is done, then the work is done. No need to stick around till the whistle goes off. Yeah. So I think yeah, if that's all right with you, if there's no further questions, I'm happy to let you all go. And if you want to reach out, please do. I'm always happy to chat and build.